as you all can see, we have a very special guest. This guy kicks butt, especially with that mapping. This is Scott from Kalibrated. Scott, I hope all is well with you and your family.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? All right.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Everything is good with me, and I hope everything is good with yours as well.
All right, Scott, let's get into it. What is going on in Ukraine right now? And I ask you that in context of this. Just 2 weeks ago, you heard Polish officials saying that they would not engage in shooting down Russian missiles over Ukraine, even as if they could. That's one thing, as if they could, but they would not engage in that. And Russian officials said that if that would happen, then they would take that as an attack on Russia. So now, fast forward it to today, when the Polish, I believe Tusk, I believe it was the president. Is Tusk the president? No, what is it? Radislaw. That's what I'm talking about. Radislaw says that it is Poland's duty to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine. And I'm pulling up this article, and I want to get your input on this because it's on RT, and it says Poland has duty to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukraine. That's the foreign minister, and it says Warsaw has a right to self-defense. They use this term all the time. Despite conflict escalation concerns, Radislaw Sikorski has said Poland and other NATO members bordering Ukraine must be able to shoot down Russian missiles and drones that they believe pose a threat, even if they are not in their airspace. Now, are they trying to cower Russia? Are they trying to see what the temperature is like on Russia's reaction, or they're just crazy as hell trying to start World War III?
I think what you're seeing more with these sort of claims is sort of the thing we've seen throughout the entirety of the war. There's always this sort of need for the West right now, because if you look at the Ukraine project in totality, in my personal opinion, the initial goal was to secure the East for the Ukrainians and pull Ukraine fully into NATO after the East issue was solved, the Civil War was solved. Once that failed and Russia invaded Ukraine, the sanction regime was supposed to remove Putin from office. Like that was the goal of this whole Ukraine project, using Ukraine against Russia, right? And against Putin specifically, to remove him and then split the Russian-Chinese relationship up, because China's the real threat to the United States coming up here in terms of being a near-peer competitor. So that was the initial goal. After that failed, and it was obvious that the sanction regime had failed and everything, we started to see this sort of line pushing. They're seeing how far they can go before a Russian reaction occurs. And the Russians have been very calm throughout this entire SMO. I mean, we saw Nord Stream get blown up. We've seen Russia invaded, Russia attacked multiple times with multiple different systems, including Western systems. So there is this constant escalation, but it's always just right. They're just edging up to the line, right? And one of Ukraine's biggest issues right now is the lack of air defense. They are struggling immensely with air defense systems. And one of the ways that the Western allies could potentially ease some of these issues for Ukraine is by engaging Russian aerial targets, missiles, and drones where they can near the border. So protecting cities like Lvov in Western Ukraine via Polish air defense. This is it's an idea. I mean, it wouldn't benefit Ukraine that much because there's not that many missiles that head to that part of the country in general. It's not like Poland can bring their air defenses to Kiev and to protect Kiev. But in terms of protecting the Western airspace, potentially, the issue that comes along with this is, well, for one, we got a report from Washington today that said anybody who's going to engage Russian missiles on behalf of Ukraine is accepting a great risk onto themselves. So in that statement alone, you're kind of seeing Washington pull away, and they have been pulling away for a while now. They've been pulling away with ATACMS. They've been pulling away with talks of next year's budgetary spending for Ukraine and everything like that. And what you're going to see, and this is what I've been talking about for a long time, is Europe is going to be held with the Ukraine project bag, right? The fiscal responsibility, whatever military means Ukraine needs, because for Europe, Ukraine is much more of an existential issue, especially if Ukraine loses really bad here in the coming year or so. You could see a massive influx of refugees into Europe. And that is not what the European economies need right now. It is just not healthy for Europe. It's not healthy for Poland. So Poland, some of these other Eastern European countries, and Britain and France are starting to feel this immense pressure. So you're going to start to see a lot of these sort of like ideas being tossed out. We saw the French troops being sent to Ukraine to provide more manpower in rear areas. That didn't work out because, again, the risk of escalation, the risk of losing French civilian or French military in Ukraine doesn't play well in France. And the same goes for Poland. You have these sort of like eccentric conversations about how we can protect Ukraine, how we can help them to win. But in reality, when you look at the situation in Poland, nobody in Poland wants to help Ukraine anymore. A lot of the talk is about how Ukraine has to start recognizing their history in regards to like the Volyn massacre and their celebration of Stefan Bandera, especially in the western part of the country, who was a perpetrator of the Holocaust and genocide against the Polish people. So there's that. There's a lot of historical hate in the region between the Poles and the Ukrainians, and really this is just another. There's sort of multiple factions that talk about what's going on, and part of that faction in Poland is the very pro-Ukraine project faction, who's going to basically say anything, almost to the point of, well, we're going to invade Western Ukraine if the Russians win, just so that the Russians can't win. It's an alliance out of necessity, not out of want. The Ukrainians and the Poles did not get along before 2022, and the only reason they're getting along now is a common enemy.
Do you think also there's something behind that Poland wants the so-called historical Polish lands back, and they're helping Ukraine to destroy itself to try to put it in a position where they can annex those lands?
Potentially that could be something that's going on. I don't necessarily think that they're trying to like poison them. I think if the opportunity arose, that I don't think the Polish would hesitate, especially if it means it's going to go to the Russians or something like that, or it's going to become this neighbor vassal state that really hampers Polish security and stuff like that, which is a potential to happen, right? If there's a rump state of Ukraine, nothing good is going to come out of that rump state towards Poland, right? So the only potential there I would see is to go in and take those historical lands after Ukraine collapses, because Poland wants Ukraine there. Ukraine being a buffer zone for Poland is better for Poland, but if the collapse happens, I would not think that they would hesitate to go in and take their historical land. And the issue with it really is you're inheriting a lot of those problems that we were just talking about between Ukrainians and Polish, right? That part of that country has part Ukrainian, part Polish. So if you go in and you take those historical lands, you're inheriting all of those historical problems, as well as inheriting land that doesn't particularly yield a lot economically. So it's going to be a massive burden on Poland to go in and take these places and then introduce their infrastructure and stuff like that into these places. So while there's potential for that happening, I think that it's going to be very, very expensive for Poland, and it probably won't pay off in the long run very well for them.
So let's hypothesize for a minute. What if Poland or a NATO country engages Russian missiles over Ukraine? Isn't that an act of war?
Technically, yes, but I think that just with hindsight, we can look back at what the Russians have done and how they have operated throughout the entirety of this war. The way I look at it is that the Russians are doing basically the exact opposite of what the West wants them to do constantly. The West wants them to escalate. It's really something that I've noticed is that there seems to be this massive cultural divide between Russian peoples, the way they think, the way they operate, the way they approach problems, and the way that the West does. And it might just have something to do with us being the hegemony. We think that we can just click indoors wherever we want and nobody's going to say anything. Maybe that's part of it. But the Russians have worked incredibly hard to prevent civilian casualties. if you look at the civilian casualties in Ukraine over the past 2 years, 2.5 years, it's been about 20 to 30,000 civilians casualties total, and that's on both sides of the conflict. So that's Ukrainians killing Russian and other Ukrainian civilians, and then Russians killing Ukrainian civilians, which 30,000 over 2.5 years of a war of this scale and intensity and taking place in cities and stuff like that is extremely low. You can look at places like Gaza and see that the civilian casualties there are extremely high in less than a year compared to Ukraine in 2.5 years. And the Russians have been firing way more munitions than the Israelis have. So it kind of shows the approach, the fact that there are nightclubs still open in Kiev and all of this stuff really speaks to the fact that the Russians are going extremely easy on the Ukrainians. And that's not how the West approaches war. If you look at Iraq, if you look at any of these wars that we've fought recently, we go in, we wipe everything, we restart, we nation build. That's not what Russia is going for. It hasn't been their prerogative this entire war. So the West is trying to escalate with Russia, but the Russia is not letting the situation escalate to the point that the West wants. It seems to me that not all of the West, again, there are power groups in the West. The neocon sort of group that is really pushing the Ukraine project still is the group that I think is expecting Russia to, when the Ukrainians went into Kursk, I think that was an idea that Washington did not approve of, but people in Washington did approve of it, right? So the official position of Washington is no, don't do this. It's not going to help. But there are people in Washington who are really wanting this to go ahead. And so I think that the Russians just are not responding the way the West is expecting them to, and the Russians are going to continue to not respond the way that the West wants them to. So in terms of missiles flying over the country being intercepted in Poland, if it does happen, there will be consequences for Poland. Are the Russians going to declare war? No, there's really no point in doing that. But a risk that Poland is incurring is that if Russia were to declare war or were to do something provocative in the other direction, NATO would not necessarily come to Poland's aid in that case. And that is exactly why I brought up the whole Washington statement, saying that you're on your own if you do this to any of the Eastern European states is a clear sign that NATO Article 5 will not be invoked unless something dramatic happens in a different direction. If you're taking on this risk, you are also taking on the consequences of that risk. And I think that is a big reason why you're not going to see any Russian missiles shot down unless they're over Polish airspace, which the Polish have the right to shoot down missiles over their airspace. Or if, like I said, something dramatic changes, but I just don't see that happening.
Well, why is Russia taking this? Why do you think Russia is taking this laid back approach? Because there are a lot of people that are saying that Russia should. I'm one of the ones who is saying that when a bully continues to escalate, sometimes to prevent war, you have to slap them a couple of times, to prevent war. Because if you continue to give them a free hand, if you give them an inch, they're going to take 2 miles. And I was talking to Dr. Paul Craig Roberts day before, I think 2 days ago or something like that. And he is in that same mind that Russia should smack the West in the mouth because the West cannot defeat Russia militarily anyhow. So he's saying, listen, to stop the provocations, the escalations, why would you allow the West to continue to invade Russia, to strike Russia, to even this has escalated even into the African continent where they gave information to kill Wagner troops in Africa. I mean, so if you don't hit them back, you allow for the escalation. Why do you think Russia is acting in such a manner?
So are you specifically talking about a direct reaction to the West, or are you talking about a reaction in Ukraine that sends a message to the West? I'm just for clarity.
I'm talking about, okay, if the provocations come against Russia in Ukraine, Russia should react against the provocations in Ukraine. But if the provocations of the West comes to Russia proper, then Russia should send a provocation to the West in a Western area proper.
Yeah, and that's I would just say that's that's just an aggressive foreign policy stance, which is fine, and that is and particularly this is what I'm talking about for the Western way of thinking, because initially that's my first thought too, and I sort of have to find myself breaking this cycle of thought where I'm like, oh, somebody punches me, I got to punch them back harder, right? And I got to send a message so that this guy never punches me again. That is, and I'm not saying that it's only an American way of thinking. It just seems that in this sort of boxing match, that's the way that the West is always approaching this. If we get smacked, we're going to smack you back harder. If Israel gets smacked, Israel's going to smack back harder, right? That's sort of the escalation dominance idea. I think that what Russia is doing is geostrategically winning this war instead of reacting. And I always make this argument. People always say, Putin is being so embarrassed by this incursion. I say embarrassment is something that one feels. Embarrassment is not something that other people can really put on you. You can show weakness or whatever, but you can change that the next time something happens. So in terms of embarrassment, I always say that embarrassing doesn't win wars. Being embarrassed doesn't lose you a war, right? You can be embarrassed but still be winning a war. You can be embarrassed in a war, but geostrategically you're still winning. And I think that Russia's approach to Ukraine had to be specifically incredibly soft for a couple of reasons. The first reason was the narrative on why they invaded. Invasions are never good. Russia invading when they're not a hegemony like the United States, because the United States can just do whatever they want. Nobody's going to say anything. But when it comes to Russia, Russia is up against a hegemony, right? So they have to be very careful about how they approach this war. They couldn't go in Chechnya style, destroying everything, leveling places, and just moving through that way. Because for one, that doesn't support their narrative of trying to protect Russian-speaking peoples, protecting the Ukrainian peoples even from the Western-backed coup regime that was put into place in Ukraine. So on that narrative, they had to go in soft. There was no way. Another aspect of the soft approach, I think, is keeping allies on side. So particularly China, India, Saudi Arabia, most of BRICS, right? The countries that have basically kept the Russian economy up and going this entire war. India buying tons of Russian oil and reselling it to Europe has been a huge savior for the Russian economy, because they didn't really lose their entire European market. It just switched to a middleman in India, and then that went to Europe. The Chinese market opened up. And really, how I think they maintained a lot of those relationships was by being very calm and being very non-reactive to what's going on, because China doesn't want to work with a partner that is, committing some sort of genocide or whatever, however it might look, even if it's not necessarily a genocide. You don't want that ally. Like, it's hard for the US to be allies with Israel right now, right? They have to be very careful about how they approach everything. If you look at like Kamala running right now, she's in the middle of trying to tamper down protests at the DNC and stuff like that about the Palestine issue, while at the same time trying to keep the Israeli lobby on side. It's such a hard thing to do, right? For politicians, for governments, everything. So part of the soft approach is definitely keeping everybody on side. I think the Russians have made themselves look like the mature good guys in all of this, which is a very difficult thing to do when you invade a country and you're taking territory. But everybody's watching how the West approaches this conflict with this hyper aggression and, we're going to invade and we're going to strike Russia proper and we're going to hit oil refineries and energy infrastructure and stuff like that. And Russia just sits there and goes, okay, we're going to keep winning the war. We're going to let you do what you're going to do. We're not going to react that way. And then in the future, I'm telling you, you're going to see all of those sort of red lines that were crossed, all of the muted reactions from the Russians. You're going to see all of that come home eventually. The time and the place is more important than the, making it known right away that the Russians are reacting.
And speaking of, you're right on point. I want to play a little clip from a British politician and what he had to say about Vladimir Putin, Russia, and what they think of the West. So it's only about 2 minutes, so check this out.
A former chief advisor to a British prime minister has called the West's involvement in Ukraine a stupid mistake, with sanctions having little or no impact on Russia. That says the top strategist seeks to return to political office in a new role and with a new party.
We should have never got into the whole stupid situation. It's not a replay of 1940 with Potemkin Zelensky as the Churchillian underdog. This whole Ukrainian corrupt mafia state has basically conned us all, and we're all going to get f***ed as a consequence. The lesson we've taught Putin is that we're a bunch of total jokers. I mean, Putin already knew that before the war. But this has emphasized it and broadcasted to the entire world what a bunch of clowns we are. And America is now doubling down on trying to seize Russian assets. So it's already created a sanctions regime, which is encouraging the building of alternative financial systems globally. That's not teaching Putin any lesson, only that we're idiots.
Dominic Cummings is a British political strategist well known for campaigning in favor of the UK's Brexit in 2016. He later became chief advisor to former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Cummings is now involved in creating the Startup Party, a bloc he says will unite entrepreneurs, health workers, and military veterans to oppose the ruling Tories. Now, that's ahead of the next UK general election, which will take place by January 2025. Journalist Martin Jay says Cummings' remarks show his common sense, with the strategist anticipating a disaster for the Tories at the next election.
And we've seen, the spectacular mistakes, the miscalculations of the West, in particular Russian sanctions, just to name one. I think his words are not even prescient. They're just common sense chime that a lot of people will agree with. Let's not forget, he's bitter. He was kicked out of his particular party, the entourage around Boris Johnson. There was a bit of a nasty breakup, and he was always this sort of polemic, rebellious, sort of maverick type character who now is looking to relaunch his own political career. But I think if you read those articles, the British newspaper articles which mentioned this, I think it was the Telegraph, it's quite clear that he wants to wait and see, and just to see how much of a disaster the general election is in the UK, to see how far the political implications are of the Conservative Party. Just how much will it break up? Will it self-implode? And if it does crash quite from a great height, then we might see the emergence of one of these parties by Cummings. But he's an oddball, and he's an odd character, and I think he's very clever at manipulating the press.
That said, the politician is saying that Vladimir Putin has played the West, and that he's exposed the hypocrisy, the arrogance, and the stupidity of Western leaders. What do you have to say about the little clip we just played?
That's just pretty much common sense. I think that Britain in particular, I think that Washington has sort of this, I'm sorry, my dog's barking. I don't know if you can hear that.
I have a cat, so I understand.
I think that Britain has really done itself in. It's not an empire anymore. It's just a vassal of the United States at this point. But they still have this aura air about them where they think that they're somehow still an empire. They can still force policy all over the world and stuff like that. It just shows how politically bankrupt I want to say. There's no depth to the political pool in Britain and in Washington, really. It's very shallow. There's not a lot of change, not a lot of options. And the really key part of that article that I think everybody should really pay attention to is the instigation of new monetary systems. Mm-hmm. That is the key aspect there. The West has done so much damage in giving Russia free agency. The biggest thing that came out of 2014 in Crimea and 2022 when the Russians invaded was the two different sanctions packages that the United States put on Russia. The first one for Crimea was just a taste. And the Russians saw how that affected their economy. And over the next 8 years, they just built bunkers around their economy, basically, so that if something was to happen, because they were figuring that this would happen eventually, the West's posture towards Russia has been getting more and more aggressive and just worse over the last 15 or so years, since about 2006. And the Russians knew this was coming. So they saw the damage that was done by a little bit of sanctions, and they said, oh shit, we need to get ourselves ready for this. So when those sanctions hit in 2022, they didn't do an eighth of what they were supposed to do. Russia was self-sufficient basically in almost every single market that they needed. And any market that they weren't self-sufficient in, they had allies on side, which is another reason I talk about the soft approach. Is you have to keep China trading with you. You have to keep India trading with you. You have to keep these places, especially for like microchips and just things that the Russians need in vast amounts for a war effort. You have to keep allies on side. So I think that is the key thing. And the biggest aspect of what this war means is that the U.S. doesn't have Russia under its thumb anymore in terms of the monetary system. It can't just remove them from SWIFT. The Russians aren't going to default on their loans. Stuff like that is not going to happen. And what you're going to see happen, and it's very detrimental to the U.S.'s geostrategic position around the world, is BRICS is going to create a new monetary system akin to SWIFT, and that is going to open up the door for every other nation around the world to get out from under that thumb of the United States. And it could become a very volatile time. You could see a lot of coups, a lot of little wars in these countries, specifically Africa and South America. But this is what multipolarism is, right? Multipolarism, if you want it, there will be a period of turbulence, to say the least. So when you're talking about what the West has done and how foolish they look, yes, this will be regarded as one of probably the biggest mistakes that the West has made geostrategically since maybe, maybe Vietnam, maybe. I mean, but Vietnam didn't have a lot of consequences for the United States at the time. So this is going to have severe, severe consequences. I can't really think of a thing this bad, maybe besides
maybe worse
standard, maybe.
I think it may be one of the greatest strategic blunders of the West, because with this strategic blunder, America is losing her global position. She's losing her political clout. And more than anything, the dollar is losing its foothold and stranglehold on global finance. And without the life's blood of the American empire cannot fund infinite wars. She cannot expand her military bases. And I think this may be one of the greatest strategic blunders in the history of the American Republic and the American Empire. But I want to ask you, what is the situation like now? Because, man, I mean, you kick butt with those maps. Everybody should go to Kalibrated. This guy kicks butt with those maps. What is it like in Ukraine right now? What on the ground? Because I heard that the front line is buckling all across Ukraine. What is that? I mean, what does that entail when it comes to Russian advances, and what does that entail when it comes to whether or not Russia will go to the Dnieper River?
All right, so just a little bit of background for your listeners. The Ukrainians have been in a pretty difficult position now for a little over a year. Western support is starting to fade. The Ukrainians, from the beginning of the war, have always had a mathematical issue that they had to solve, and that was their ability to produce manpower. Quality manpower is a difficult thing to produce, and Ukraine was in a demographic crisis before the war started. If you look at the demographics of Ukraine, the 18 to 25-year-old male population is the smallest, and the 60 to 80-year-old population is the largest. So they have a huge welfare state, basically, supporting this very old demographic. They don't have a huge economy because they don't have a lot of young people working. So from the beginning, they had these issues. The war just made this so much worse. And the way Ukraine fights these wars by never retreating, holding everything with manpower, meat, basically, is an unfortunate way of describing it, has cost them tremendously. We saw this in Bakhmut. We saw it affect the counteroffensive last year in 2023. And then for the last year, the Russians have just been attriting Ukrainian forces in the positions that they have been in, and we haven't seen a ton of movement. Up until about March of this year, we started to see the lines start to move more actively. Things started to become more fluid, and it really became very clear that the Ukrainians were having some serious issues with ammunition, with equipment, with manpower. The Russians have just been building their military industrial complex has just been gaining strength for 2.5 years. And it does take about 2 years for a military industrial complex to come online. When the US was attacked during Pearl Harbor, we were not ready for war until 1943 or 44, like realistically, because it just takes time to produce everything you need to produce for a war and produce military aged men for combat missions and stuff like that. It just takes time. So the Ukrainians don't have that time. And since about March, we've started to see this buckling of the Ukrainian lines. Not anything overly dramatic at that time, but just much more movement than we were regularly seeing. And rumors started to come out. The reports from the front line started to get really bad, and something needed to change. That something ended up being the Kursk incursion by the Ukrainians. For those of you who don't know, the Ukrainians on August 6th invaded the Kursk region of Russia with a few brigades worth of manpower, which was a huge escalation. Entering into Russia, you're no longer the victim. Now you're taking the war to Russia. That was their whole thing. A huge strategic blunder, in my personal opinion, just in the way that they approached it. But really, the Ukrainians were just choosing between a bad option and a worse option at the time, right? The static defense was just a death by 1,000 cuts scenario, and they were dying. They were about to die. The only other option they had was to take reserves from that area and go into another region. They went into Kursk. Kursk is now bogged down, not moving. The Ukrainians are now wasting resources. They have extended their front lines and extended their logistics lines into Russia proper. Not a really good play. They didn't achieve their goals, which was, I believe, securing a nuclear power plant. None of that happened. And now, like I said, the Ukrainians are just holding on to the salient like they regularly do, and it's just costing them and costing them and costing them. All while the Russians never pulled out of the east to go stop this, because the idea was, just like the Russian incursion into Vovchansk and Kharkov previously, was to pull Russian reserves away from the east up to the north to defend Russia proper. The issue is Russia has mobile reserves now. Russia has more manpower in Ukraine than Ukraine has in Ukraine in terms of the military manpower numbers. So the Russians didn't need to take that bait, run away from the east, and start attacking Kursk and pushing the Ukrainians out. What they did instead was they just slowed the Ukrainians down, attrited them in Kursk, and kept pushing in the east. And this is where you have seen this major collapse happen. And you cannot describe it as anything other than a major collapse. The Russians have gotten through multiple lines of fortified Ukrainian defenses, which is not an easy thing to do. And they have reached a key city of Pokrovsk in the southwest, or southeast, sorry. And this key city is a junction, a 6-highway meeting point, basically a crossroads, where the Russians will be able to explode and potentially go to the Dnieper River at this point, securing half of Ukraine. There's a reason why the war is being fought in the east by the Ukrainians, and there's a reason why they're not retreating. If you look at the map, the east is an urban conglomerate. It was the industrial heart of the Soviet Union. It has factories, it has mines, it has tunnels. It is a defender's dream. When you get just west of that, it's flat, open fields. And it was the Soviet nightmare when the Germans invaded, right? Because the Germans could just roll over this flat territory extremely quick, and it's super hard to defend. So the Ukrainians are defending where they can. After the east, the next line is the Dnieper. And I have never seen the lines move this fast. I've never seen the Russians achieve this much success, taking so few casualties. It's just this snowball, and this snowball has been growing and growing and growing, and it's reaching terminal velocity coming down this hill. And when it reaches terminal velocity, you will see a massive rout of the Ukrainian armed forces.
Do you think Russia will take Kiev?
I think that Russia will take whatever. So in terms of what their goals are, I can't necessarily tell you. I can only tell you what I've heard from officials. Putin in about June gave an ultimatum basically to the Ukrainians and said, you guys can leave the 4 oblasts that are currently annexed by Russia. So that's Zaporozhye, Kherson, including Kherson City across the river, the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. So those 4. And obviously, that's a non-starter for negotiations for Ukraine. They're not going to pull out of those territories. That's a huge loss for the West. The other things were sanctions relief and stuff like that. And that was just to get the Russians to come to the negotiating table. After that, Putin had mentioned that this was the last and best offer that the Ukrainians were going to receive. After that, the Ukrainians went into Kursk. Putin came out and said negotiations are not happening anymore. It's completely off the table. We're not negotiating. And the Ukrainians really, really pissed off the Chinese. This is something that a lot of people did not notice, but the foreign minister of Ukraine had just recently gone to China and basically lied to them for about 3 days about how they were going to try to achieve peace and how they weren't going to do exactly something like this. They stopped striking Russian oil infrastructure for a while with drones for about 2 months. Things started to seem like it was calming down. The Russians stopped striking Ukrainian energy infrastructure as well. It looked like there was some sort of backdoor deal happening potentially with the Chinese to at least ease escalation and move into some sort of negotiating position. The Ukrainians did this, pissed off the Chinese, pissed off the Russians, and now the Russians are treating this war very different. And we've seen a very, 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 very different set of rules of engagement for the Russians in particular. The amount of double tap strikes on Ukrainian positions. So what that is, for people who don't know, is a military position is found by the Russians. They hit it with a missile, and then military tends to respond to the strike to go in and pull the military out, but also first responders go. That is then struck again. That's what a double tap strike is. The U.S. is notorious for doing it. We kind of invented it. And the Russians have not been doing it the entire war because of the risk that it takes to civilians sometimes. But in terms of effectiveness, double tap strikes are extremely effective. So we're seeing a lot of that now. The soft hand is really starting to fade from the Russians. And I think that what that was they kept the Chinese on side the entire time. And now the Chinese are pissed at the Ukrainians and they're like, go ahead, do whatever you want. You see what you're dealing with. You've made it very clear. You've tried for 2.5 years to make something happen. You tried for 8 years before that with Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, which the West has openly come out and said we're just buying time for Ukraine to arm itself. So they're like, you're going to do what you're going to do. If the regime is removed by the Ukrainian population, the Zelensky regime is removed by the Ukrainian population, or if they are forced to go into exile for some reason, right? I do believe that the Russians will probably take Kiev. If it's there for the taking, at least they will capture it for a time being. Maybe there will be some deal where a rump Ukraine will get Kiev back, because I don't really think the Russians are super interested in anything west of the river, to be quite frank, besides maybe Odessa and Nikolaev, which if Kiev falls, then those are going to go to Russia anyway. So, but in terms of like Lvov and a lot of the east, it's not Russia. It has never been a Russian culture place, right? There's not a lot of Russian speakers in this region. It's more Polish, Hungarian, Romanian than even like Ukrainian in some parts of it. So I don't think the Russians really want it. There's not a real economic use for that region. And the river makes a very, very, very strong dividing line for the Russians in between the east, between the west and the east. So I think that Kiev will be taken if the opportunity presents itself. I think that this is sort of what you're seeing happening in Belarus right now. A lot of people are looking at the whole Belarus thing, and they're talking about a potential incursion and stuff like that. And I don't think that the Belarus military is going to get involved in any means, but I do think that they're starting to get these exercises ready and starting to be in a state of readiness so that if there is some sort of collapse, a peacekeeping force can move in quickly, secure everything, and then the Russians can decide how everything's divvied up and what goes where.
And the reason I ask about Kiev is because that's historically Russian also. At one time, that was the capital of Russia. So I would think that the Russians would want Kiev back. But a lot of the things that you're saying got my mind going. Why would Russia leave a rump Ukraine for NATO, even though it may be unviable economically. Why would they leave that territory for NATO so that NATO could then provoke Russia from those lands right there? Why wouldn't they just take it all and set up a government there that is friendly to Russia? Because we know that Western Ukraine is not friendly to Russia, but the consequences of leaving it to the West is like 10, 20 times worse than just setting up your own government there in the rump state. Why would they allow the West to get Western Ukraine?
So the way things are playing out right now, it doesn't really seem like, okay, so first off, if Poland and those countries come in and get their little bits of Western Ukraine, that's not going to change the dynamic that much. That's not going to be a big deal. That's not going to really change the whole equation for the Russians at all. But when you're talking about how the war ends, there's multiple ways that the war can end, right? The Russians may push all the way to Poland. If that happens and that's what's needed, that's what they're going to do. I don't think that that's what's going to be needed, and I think that the war will end far before that. And I've said this quite frequently. The East is where the war will end. The war will not end in the West. The war will end in the East, and then the Russians are just going to push west once the Ukrainian army isn't standing in the way. Because once those lines break, morale is going to collapse. There's not going to be a way to stabilize it, and it's just going to, again, snowball into this horrible situation for the Ukrainian regime. So the way I can see this happening is that there's a couple potential outcomes. One, Zelensky and that government stays in power somehow. I don't see this happening necessarily, but there's always a chance. That would be probably one of the worst outcomes for Russia. That's one of those ones where you're talking about the Ukrainian government might start rearming, doing this, that, and the other. The only way I could see them staying in power, or him in power, and then whoever comes after him, the next puppet, would be some sort of ceasefire along some sort of lines, which I just don't see happening. I don't see the Ukrainian government surviving this. I don't see the Ukrainian economy surviving this. What I do see happening is eventually that government is either going to be exiled or removed, whatever that entails. And then the next government that comes in is not going to be pro-Western the way this government is pro-Western. You're already starting to see this sentiment arise. The West is already letting Ukraine down. And I've been saying this for 2.5 years. Ukraine is no different than South Vietnam. It's no different than Afghanistan. It's no different than the Kurds in Syria. It's no different than any other proxy that we've ever supported. Outside of maybe Israel, the U.S. uses until the usefulness is gone, and then we forget about it because they're not our people. It's just a means to an end, and Ukraine is just a means to an end. Nobody in the U.S. gave a shit about Ukraine 3 years ago. Nobody could point it out on a map. Nobody cared. It was wild for me to be hyper focused on Ukraine for so many years and know so much about it, to then have people telling me that I'm wrong and I don't know anything because they just figured out about it last week when Russia invaded. I was like, dude, shut up. Just shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. But that's how it was. Everybody became an expert overnight. And there's that. There are those outcomes. And I think the most realistic outcome for this is that if there is a rump Ukrainian state, that rump Ukrainian state has to sign some pretty horrific agreements in terms of what the current Ukrainian state is going through with the Russians, meaning neutrality on NATO, absolutely. So NATO's not going to be able to use that rump state to arm it. And the second that rump state begins to be armed by NATO again, potentially in the future, they'll just get reinvaded. Right. And they won't have time to build up like they did the last 8 years. The Russians are not going to take that chance. So it'll restart and the Russians will do what they have to do again. So there's that. And I think the other aspect is why leave a rump state? Because if you leave a Ukraine that you just say it's Kiev to Lvov, right? And then the Russians get Nikolaev and Odessa and it's a landlocked country, that becomes a economically sterile tumor on the back of the EU. That because it's the Ukraine project, they have to support it, right? And there's going to be all of these people in this country, and they've lost all of their economic value because it's all in the east. That's where all of the mines are. That's where all of the resources are. That's where a majority of the agricultural land is. And that's, I mean, if you lose access to the Black Sea, you lose your ability to ship out massive amounts of grain. It's going to put the EU in a position where they're going to be dealing with a place like Greece economically, like they've been dealing with Greece, but so much worse, and with people that are currently going to be very angry at Europe for how Europe, abandoned them, as is how they're going to see it. There's no way they're not going to see it like that, and you're already seeing the talks about it. The fact that the U.S. isn't letting Ukraine strike Russian military bases inside of Russia with ATACMS, or medium-range ballistic missiles, because it will probably start a wider regional war. It's a very smart thing for Washington to do, but you're already seeing a lot of the information space being like, fuck Jake Sullivan because he isn't letting us start a third world war. Like that's literally the sentiment. It's only going to get worse. And the second the US drops Ukraine, I'm telling you, there's going to be this nasty anti-West faction in Ukraine that they're just going to have to deal with for the next couple decades. And I don't think the hate is going to be directed towards the Russians in the way that the West thinks it's going to be directed towards them. I don't think there's going to be this massive guerrilla war. The Ukrainian geography doesn't support that. I don't see the West ever being able to utilize Ukraine again. This was their shot to use Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to be a viable proxy after this war, even if Ukraine still exists as a state.
And if it exists as a state, do you think the West, because the West is very vindictive, especially the American leadership, do you think that they would just say, you know what, let's arm Ukraine with nuclear weapons?
No, because that takes a lot of time, and it's going to be spotted instantly. The second you give them nuclear weapons, the Russians would use a tactical nuclear weapon. There's no that giving a regime that has openly committed terrorist acts inside of Russia and is extremely desperate. That would be that when I talk about getting reinvaded again. The second anybody talked about giving Ukraine nukes, they would be just invaded further by the Russian military. So, no, I don't see that happening at all. I think the whole nuke talk is pretty, it's just over exaggerated. The Ukrainians aren't going to get nukes. The only way that the Ukrainians get a nuclear device is if they build some sort of dirty bomb, but the damage from that is going to be rather negligible in totality. It would still be a horrific thing, but again, if the Ukrainians do something like this, just like the Kursk incursion, it's just a casus belli for Putin to continue doing whatever he wants. It makes Putin look better. It makes the Russians look better. Honestly, this is really bad from like a humanist standpoint. Like I don't want people to get hurt. I don't want anything like that to happen. But the more reckless and unhinged Ukraine gets, the worse the situation for Ukraine is going to get. Right? The West cannot be partnered with an ally who's committing terrorist acts like that. They don't want to be associated with that. And it just makes the Russians look completely justified in their war of defense.
So when, I know this is like soothsaying, when do you think the lines will really start crumbling where Russia, we're seeing Russia making massive gains, but Ukraine is putting up some resistance. When do you think more strategic areas will fall to Russia? Because your maps, they're showing a lot of strain on the Ukrainian military across the line of contact.
Yeah, so in terms of when the lines are going to start like moving, like you're talking like dozens of kilometers a day. Is that what you're more referring to?
Yes.
Yeah. That I think you're going to start to begin to see that stuff come November, December. As soon as the muddy season ends here in Ukraine, I think during the muddy season, so usually September, October, the ground gets really soft and it's hard to move armor on the mud. Ukraine has thick black soil, so everything sinks. I think you're going to see the Battle of Pokrovsk and Minhorod, which is the big logistics city that the Russians are quickly approaching. This is where the massive breakthrough has happened. I think you're going to see the battle for that city during the muddy season. And then as soon as the muddy season is over, you're going to see the big push. But while that muddy season is going on, you are still going to see a lot of Russian progress. I'm not saying it's going to slow down or stop by any means, but just in terms of actually having a massive breakthrough where you have almost no resistance and you're just driving in a straight line, I would say probably like December, January, February.
One of our viewers, Cheese Puff, says, does Scott think there is any chance the Ukrainian populace will pose a problem to the Zelensky government, possible uprising?
I think that it is very difficult currently for the Ukrainian population to do that. I think that the martial law, censorship, communications control, everything going on in Ukraine makes a popular uprising difficult. But as the situation continues to deteriorate, I mean, you can only lie to your population for so long. And I think those lies are really starting to see some light coming through them. The Ukrainian people are starting to wake up. We're seeing a lot of protests of mass mobilization and stuff like that because people are starting to feel that this war is pointless, that it's not going anywhere, and now you're just destroying the Ukrainian state for the sake of destroying the Ukrainian state. So it is very possible. I just have a difficult time seeing it happen with the total control that the Ukrainian government seems to have. I mean, Kiev, a city of a couple million. I don't know if it's still at that right now, but you know, at least 1 million people in the city. There are Russian Iskanders coming down and striking inside of the city, and we get maybe a video or two. The censorship is unbelievable, and it's just something that it makes it hard for the public to come together and gather and overthrow the government. But as soon as those lines break and things turn into chaos, yeah, anything can happen.
So, Scott, from me, I want to ask you, what do you think the real story behind the F-16 is?
Yeah. So there's 3 stories here. The first story was sort of the one that I think is probably the most likely, and that is that the F-16s were operating in the west of the country. If anybody doesn't know, Ukraine was given 6 F-16s. They have 6 pilots that were ready to fly, so they were gifted 6. Those 6 F-16s are primarily being used for air defense in the west of the country. They're not being used in a bomber, like a fighter bomber role or a interceptor role, taking out enemy aircraft or anything like that. They're just in the west of the country, flying around, shooting down missiles and drones. So the first story we had was the one that I reported on, and that was the Ukrainian Air Force Base in Kaminsky region, which is in western Ukraine. It was the primary base that we thought F-16s would be established at because F-16s require a lot of logistics and very high quality airfields. In fact, we later figured out after the Ukrainians doxed themselves, that the F-16s were in the Ivano-Frankivsk region, but when the strike was going on, these strikes last hours, these planes are raised and they were flying around shooting down drones and missiles. In the middle of this, they landed at this airbase for refueling and rearmament. This will take 30 minutes, 40 minutes, sometimes depending. And during that time, when the plane was on the ground, the Russians struck the base with multiple likely hypersonic weapons. And likely destroyed the F-16, potentially more than one F-16 on the ground, along with their primary propaganda pilot that had been in a lot of the Ukrainian propaganda about these F-16s. So that was the first story. That was the one that I chose sort of to believe because the timeline made sense and it just kind of made sense to me. The next one was the official Ukrainian story that came out immediately. And that was that during combat operations in the F-16, the plane crashed either due to pilot error or some damage sustained either from a missile or a drone that was intercepted. And I know that might sound sort of ridiculous, but in fact, this has happened twice before in Ukraine. Ukraine has lost a MiG-29 and a MiG-27, or a Su-27 and a MiG-29, sorry, to shooting down a drone and debris hitting the plane and taking down the plane. So this is not necessarily a ridiculous statement. I didn't necessarily believe it because it sort of put a hero twist on the whole thing. You know, he died in the air. He died saving Ukrainian lives, shooting down missiles. That's how they made it sound. I was like, okay, that's the propaganda one. And then I think the Western story came out, because the Western story, the next story that the Ukrainians started pushing was that this was potentially a friendly fire incident where a Patriot air defense battery had fired upon the F-16. And this is the perfect cleanup story for this entire situation, because the F-16, an American icon, basically, of the American industrial complex, was taken down not by the Russians, was not hit at a base by the Russians. It was not destroyed by a Russian drone or an Iranian drone in the air. It was destroyed by their own air defense system because a Ukrainian made the mistake. So this is like the most perfect symbolic comment to make about this war. And it's exactly what I talk about with Ukraine just getting thrown under the bus and forgotten about. Is no, the Russians didn't hit the F-16. It was your guys' fault for shooting it down with the only weapon that could shoot it down, which was the American Patriot. It's just all too clean and too proper and too nice for me. Again, not impossible. And no matter what happened, I would say it's rather distressing that you lost an F-16 in the first month of having them in operation, either on the ground, which is horrible. Losing an airframe on the ground, especially in the west of the country, is a really bad look. Losing it to a drone interaction is really bad, because that means you can't even deal with unmanned aerial vehicles like lawnmowers flying through the sky without taking down your own planes. It points to massive pilot incompetency and stuff like that. So that's another bad look. Or you have a friendly fire incident where your blue on blue target recognition isn't working, and your air defense operators are so incompetent that they think an F-16, an American airframe, looks anything like a missile, a drone, or a Russian airframe. They look entirely different on radar. They have completely different radar signatures. So if they did shoot it down, it was a massive mistake, and it was bad. And immediately after this, the commander of the Ukrainian Air Force was removed from his position by Zelensky. So why would you remove the commander of the Air Force for a mistake of a lowly air defense operator? Maybe you're just trying to put the blame on somebody and make it look like it's solved, and the West can not ask questions about it. We got rid of the problem. My opinion on this is that he was removed because of the information leak that happened at the base where these planes were being stored. That information leak and the information leak that the planes had landed at Kaminsky Airfield led to the Russian strike that likely destroyed this F-16, and I believe that's why he was fired. That's a legitimate reason to fire somebody rather than an accident, right? That doesn't make any sense. So,
yeah, because I know now the reports are coming out in the West now, and they're saying it's leaking a little bit in the I think New York Times or the Washington Post that this was not friendly fire. It was not down by friendly fire. It was not pilot error. They won't say that it was a Russian strike that took the plane out. They would just say that it was not pilot error, and they are not believing the story that it was friendly fire. I think this is the United States trying to double back and cover itself after putting out its version of the propaganda.
Well, I mean, they didn't want to deliver any of this. They didn't want to deliver these F-16s. The war was never supposed to get to this point. That's the thing, is the war was never supposed to get to 2023. The Russian was supposed to collapse. So this isn't plan A. Plan A was to get Ukraine to take the East and then join NATO as a whole country, and that would be the end of it. And then you could use Ukraine against Russia. There was never supposed to be a war. Plan B was if Russia calls your bluff and they go in, you're going to sanction them to high hell. And then plan C was, oh shit, none of that worked. What are we supposed to do? I guess we'll just keep funneling crap into the country and try to do as much damage, and hopefully the Russian government collapses or something over this long attrition battle or whatever. Didn't happen. And now, they didn't want to deliver these F-16s. I'm sure those F-16s were promised at a time where they thought they would never have to deliver them. And this war has just been drug out and continued for so long. Same goes for the Abrams that the U.S. delivered. We delivered 31 of them. It's like nothing. It's not even worth the time to train people and get logistics set up for them and stuff. But we did it because it's just a show, because we can't really deliver a lot of Abrams. Like, this is the thing, is we don't have engines. We have boneyards filled with bodies of these Abrams, but we don't produce the engines. So the engines are really the bottleneck of the Abrams program. And the U.S. needs every single engine we have for our own, military. And so it's just a common trope. And yeah, I do think it is a perfect cover up. It is the ultimate, the Russians didn't do anything, we did it to ourselves, which is just, I don't know. If you're believing that, I feel like your logic and reasoning skills don't go very deep.
Hey, Scott, man, I thank you for joining me on this platform. We got to get you back on here, man. You kick, like I told you, you kick butt, man. I really appreciate you joining, and I'm going to send you the link to the video. You can post it.
Yeah, thank you, man. I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on.
All right, man. I thank you so much, Scott, man. Be blessed, be safe out there.
Yeah, you take care and have a great day.
All right, you too, man. Everybody, Scott gave us his hour of his time. We got to be thankful for that. I mean, Scott, you got to go to Kalibrated. This guy has maps. He's telling you how the line is moving and what's going on the battlefield. When I finally found this channel, it blew my mind, because the guy, I mean, he is on point with this stuff. So you have to go to Kalibrated and subscribe. You got to give this, and go to his Patreon also. Go to Scott's Patreon.
I should have a live stream today at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that is in 2 hours.
Give me a shout out. Scott, be blessed, man. Thank you so much. Everybody, listen. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me on this platform, the most powerful platform for truth, bar none. Remember that I love you if you love truth, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true, but above all things, stay righteous. And remember this: always do right to others, not because others are watching, but because it's the right thing to do. Because even when no one else is watching, God is watching. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Deuces, everybody. We're out of here. Peace.